four emperors, the Chatti, who Domitian so successfully propagandized victories over, and elements of the Cherusci, the tribe Arminius had led to victory in the Teutoburg Forest. This new confederation was formed gradually over the years, as the various Germanic leaders realized that they were getting nowhere fighting amongst themselves. The new Frankish supergroup was by no means a unified whole at this point, and the various barbarian kings still exercised a great deal of autonomy. But this new spirit of Germanic cooperation would in time become one of the answers to the question, why did the West fall when it did? As long as Rome was able to keep the tribes politically and militarily fractured, they had very little to fear. But once they joined forces, well, let's just say that there's a reason we call France France and not Gaul. In 257, Valerian Gallienus and Valerian II all appear to have been in the modern city of Cologne, along the Lower Rhine, dealing with the sudden Frankish onslaught. Though the Franks were pushed back like all the other invaders of the mid-250s AD, at least one group kept moving forward, and eventually crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, sacking the undefended coast towns of the deep interior. But with all three emperors posted on the Rhine, the rest of the empire began to slip quickly back into what was becoming its natural state: chaos. In the north, a Gothic tribe hit upon a novel idea that their compatriots would use to great effect in the years to come, constructing a fleet to carry them down the Black Sea coast on a raid of Asia Minor. With the Franks mostly contained, Valerian left Gallienus in charge of Gaul, while he himself headed east. But the emperor wound up having no time to pause on this new Gothic invasion, and instead replanted Valerian II as imperial figurehead along the Danube, while he continued on to Syria. He was forced to keep moving, because word had reached him that far from leaving well enough alone, Shapur was attacking Roman territory with renewed vigor. The next 2 years get really tricky for historians trying to cobble together a chronological narrative, as Valerian chose this moment to revive Roman persecutions of the Christians, leading eventually to the death of Saint Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, in 258. Cyprian was a voluminous writer, and his collected correspondence has proved to be an invaluable resource to head to when we want to double-check when an event happened or whether it happened at all. Cyprian's writings act as a tiny little lighthouse in the distance, helping us navigate our way through the historical fog. But then the Romans went and killed him, leaving us with only random inscriptions, some coins, and gut instinct to lead us the rest of the way. So, thanks for that. There are three big things that happened during this 2-year period that we have trouble dating and putting in order: the Battle of Edessa and Valerian's subsequent capture by the Sassanids, the death of his grandson Valerian II, and the revolt of Ingenuus along the Danube. Some sources claim that Valerian II died of natural causes, and that when Ingenuus heard that Valerian had been captured, he decided that the imperial family was now weak enough to revolt against. Others claim that the ambitious Ingenuus decided to revolt simply because Gallienus and Valerian were both occupied elsewhere, that he killed Valerian II to kick off his campaign, and only later learned of Valerian's capture. Finally, we have the common version, whereby it was the news of Valerian's capture that led Ingenuus to kill Valerian II and revolt against Gallienus. I don't have a good answer for which of these versions is actually correct, and I don't think anyone else does either. But a consensus seems to have grown up around the idea that Valerian II died under suspicious circumstances in 258, right around the time news reached the Danube that Valerian had joined the Sassanids in battle. In this telling, it is the news of war in the east that got Ingenuus's imagination running wild, rather than the news of the emperor's defeat. In this telling, there is a bit of a lag between the death of Valerian II and the official beginning of Ingenuus's revolt, but that when the commander on the Danube did have himself declared emperor, that Gallienus rushed over from the Rhine to put down the revolt before word of his father's capture reached the west. This all leaves 260 AD as the watershed year when the empire really melted down, with news reaching Gallienus almost simultaneously that the Sassanids had captured his father, and that his own withdrawal from the Rhine had triggered a new invasion by the Germans. The defeat of Valerian at Edessa in the east, and the Germanic invasions in the west, were, of course, the two events that led directly to the empire breaking into thirds, a state of affairs that would persist for more than a decade, until Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, the unconquered restorer of the world, put the pieces back together again in the early 270s. To deal with poor Valerian first, we must follow the emperor east in 258, after dropping Valerian II off in Pannonia. The emperor probably passed through Antioch on his way to the city of Edessa in northern Mesopotamia, where he planned to stage his coming counteroffensive. But this counteroffensive would never really get off the ground, as a nasty bout of the Cyprian plague broke out amongst the legions in 259, and Valerian's forces were left thin and weak as a result. Shapur decided to take advantage of this emperor directly. Though we know very little about the details of the battle, it is reported that despite the toll taken on the legions, they still outnumbered the Sassanids by an almost 2-to-1 ratio, leaving Valerian confident that he would still be able to steamroll Shapur's forces. But, for whatever reason, in the battle that commenced on the plains outside Edessa, the Romans were utterly routed, and practically the entire army Valerian had brought with him were either killed or captured. We don't know how exactly Valerian fell into Shapur's custody, but the traditional Roman version has it that after the battle, Valerian arranged for a meeting with Shapur to hammer out the terms of a settlement, and after arriving at the Sassanid court, the emperor was seized by the treacherous Persian king and taken prisoner. The alternative is that Valerian was simply tracked down during the battle and seized, making it easy to see why the Romans would prefer a version of events that allows the humiliating capture of their emperor to be painted as a result of a double cross, rather than trying to explain how an honorable Roman could have allowed himself to be taken alive. As with just about everything to do with this period, there are two versions of what happened next. The boring version is that Valerian and his senior officers were treated well by Shapur, and lived out the rest of their days as comfortable, if involuntary, guests of the Sassanids until the emperor's death in 264. The more salacious version is that the no-good wicked Persian king took every opportunity to humiliate the captured Valerian, and used the Roman emperor daily as a stepping stool to get in and out of his royal litter. Then, when Valerian finally died, his body was flayed and stuffed, and posted in the Persian court as a trophy for all of the East to mock and gloat over. Once again, it is easy to see why the Romans would prefer to paint the Sassanid king in the worst possible light. But barring a time machine, we'll never know the true fate of Valerian. We do know that he died in Persian custody, and that for a variety of reasons, no attempt was ever made to rescue him or pay a ransom for his return. He was in his mid-60s when he died, and had ruled the empire for 7 years. Those variety of reasons why nobody came looking for him had to do mostly with the fact that while the Eastern Empire was going to hell in a handbasket, the middle of the empire was going to hell in a handbasket, and the Western Empire was going to hell in a handbasket. In the final calculation, the life of one captured emperor was simply not worth the time and expense, not with so much hell being crammed into so many handbaskets. When news reached Gallienus that Ingenuus was in revolt, he was forced to immediately withdraw a significant portion of the Rhine troops from the border to help him put down the rebellion. As he had previously done with Valerian II, Gallienus left his second son, Salonius, in Cologne as imperial figurehead, under the protection of the commander, Marcus Cassianus Latinius Posthumus, and sped off to the Danube. Leading the suppression effort was a man who, at this point, Gallienus had supreme confidence in, but whose own ambitions would in time lead to his master's death, the general Aureolus. As commander of the imperial cavalry, Aureolus led the charge into Pannonia, where the sudden appearance of Gallienus' army took the wind out of Ingenuus' sails, and the usurper either died in battle, was killed by his own troops, or committed suicide after realizing that his cause was hopeless. The upshot of all this, as I just mentioned, was that Gallienus' new position on the Danube led to a significant invasion of Germanic tribes along the Rhine. Along the lower portion of the river, the Franks poured across the frontier as Postumus scrambled to hold them off with what forces he had been left with. Meanwhile, a huge group of Alemanni, a tribal super-confederation similar to the Franks operating along the Upper Rhine, poured through the under-garrisoned gap between the Danube and the Rhine, but rather than making for Gaul, as would have been expected, they instead decided to head directly into Italy. Obviously, this invasion of the home province was Gallienus' top priority. He ignored calls to go avenge his father in the east, who he just learned had been defeated and captured, reinforce Postumus in the west, or stay put on the Danube and hold off the Goths. He chose instead to make with all haste to Milan in northern Italy, a city that, with Gallienus' help, was about to become one of the most important cities in the empire. The Alemanni crossed the Alps into Italy before Gallienus could get in their way, and they apparently raided all the way down to Rome itself before being turned back by a hastily raised militia. Not necessarily needing to embroil themselves in a prolonged siege of the imperial capital after having grabbed so much of northern Italy's wealth, the Alemanni turned around, but on their way back north they were met by Gallienus, who beat them decisively outside of Milan. One independent faction of the Germanic invaders escaped back through the Alps with their captured treasure, but the rest were stopped short, and those who survived the battle headed back home empty-handed. Though in the end it turned out to have no long-term ill effects, the invasion of the Alemanni was nonetheless a significant psychic blow to a population of Romans already dealing with a lot of bad news. But I guess that to say that the invasion had no long-term effects is misstating the case a bit. Yes, the invaders were beaten and driven off, but the time, energy, and manpower required to do so left every other region of the empire feeling like they had been abandoned by the emperor. In the east, the shattered legions were facing down a Sasanian army they could not hope to contain. In the west, Postumus was being overwhelmed by the Franks, and in the middle, a Danube army just weakened by the battle between Ingenuus and Gallienus stared across the river at the emperor's recent withdrawal to Italy. With each of these regions left on their own, the various legionary commanders had to take it upon themselves to organize and direct local defenses, leading their troops naturally to give their commanders a rank befitting men who were now wielding supreme authority over their respective provinces, Imperator. Rather than receiving congratulations from his generals then for having driven the Alemanni out of Italy, Gallienus spent the weeks after his victory instead receiving notes that each of them had been proclaimed emperor by their troops. On the eve of his battle with the Germans, Gallienus had ruled an empire that stretched from Gibraltar to the Euphrates and from the Sahara to Scotland. The next morning,